By the late afternoon on the 2nd of February 1943, the Sixth Army was no more. Sailors from the Volga flotilla and soldiers crossed over the Volga to give bread and tinned food to the handful of civilians still left in the city of Stalingrad. However, the fighting didn't actually end on the 2nd of February. Small groups and individuals continued to fight on, hide or attempt to escape throughout the rest of the month of February. The Luftwaffe dropped 7 tons of supplies on the 3rd of February just in case, and continued to survey the area for several days looking for pockets of troops whom they could drop more supplies to. Regular Soviet divisions, fortified regions, and the NKVD all collaborated to clear up the remaining Germans, with one group of Germans being discovered near the Barricade factory on the 3rd of February, and another larger group of 75 Germans in the same area on the 7th of February. There were other groups as well. On the 7th of February 1943, a company of 229th Separate Rifle Battalion, under the commander of Junior Lieutenant N.E. Filichev, while screening the Red October region, destroyed 180 soldiers and officers and seized 216 men as prisoners. NKVD reports state that some Germans continued to resist right up until March 1943, a month after the official collapse. 2 NKVD reports say resistance ended on the 1st of March, which seems to be when the last group of Germans were overcome. But another says that most of the resistance ended in March, implying that some individuals may have continued to hide beyond March. I don't know if that's true or not, but the point is that some Germans and Hiwis didn't give up until they were forced to. It also indicates how hard it can be to eliminate small groups and individuals in irregular warfare. And it was hoped by the Germans that many of their comrades had escaped the final destruction, had broken out and were marching west. In fact, certain accounts suggest that some did actually manage to go the distance and reached friendly lines. There's one story of a soldier, Corporal Nevig, who came from a flak battery along with 19 other men. The other men hadn't made it, but Nevig had reached the 11th Panzer Division, only to be killed a few hours later when a mortar shell hit the field hospital he was staying in. Obviously, it's highly unlikely, and there's no way to verify this. It could actually just be a story made up at the time, but it is technically possible for this to have happened. Another soldier from the 100th Jaeger Division became a translator for the Soviets, and therefore accompanied them as they marched west. He managed to slip away when the unit he was with was close to the main front, and he did actually survive, so there is at least one confirmed account of someone making it back, although he didn't actually mount a breakout. However, these are the exceptions, not the rule. The people of Germany were told of the final destruction of the Sixth Army on the 3rd of February, and they were angry. The Gestapo and the SD held back as the crowds wailed or hurled insults at the Nazi leadership for having failed their brothers and sons, and for having lied to the people for so long. Even Hitler got the blame, which hadn't happened before, and graffiti appeared on walls calling him the Stalingrad murderer. There was deep depression and widespread anger. People asked how such optimistic reports had been possible only a short time earlier. They were critical of the underestimation, as in the previous winter, of the Soviet forces. Many now thought the war could not be won. Hitler himself seems to have been deeply shaken by the defeat, although he tried not to show it. But this was the beginning of his insomnia and other health issues, as well as his long monologues that he was notorious for. He would just ramble on about irrelevant topics and bore everyone to sleep. However, during a speech to the Reichsleiters and Gauleiters on the 7th of February 1943, Hitler took full responsibility for the defeat. That said, he still blamed the Romanians, Italians and Hungarians for having failed to hold the Don flank. He also once again explained that the Sixth Army had to hold on at Stalingrad in order to prevent the Red Army from advancing further, which was only a half-truth. And in reality, they hadn't been able to escape. Obviously, if they had escaped, that would have been much better for Germany than the way things had turned out. Isayev says that the Soviets had less than a third of the original tanks that they had had prior to Operation Ring, showing that the Axis had taken a serious toll on the Soviet formations in the final days of this campaign. Operation Ring cost the Soviets at least 48,000 casualties out of the original 281,158 men they had committed. But Falk says that the number was more likely 69,256, and that's a minimum. The reason is because, if we take the lower figure, then the 64th Army suffered 45% of the casualties. Whereas, if we take the higher figure, 64th Army suffered 30.5% of the casualties, which is still too high. Right? Considering that the 64th Army was just a supporting army, not a major attacking army, this ratio is far too high, suggesting that there were many more casualties than officially recorded by the Don Front. Falk actually has a good discussion on the final statistics relating to this, and also the 6th Army's losses, so for one final time, the link to Falk's website is in the description below if you're interested in picking up a copy of his book. In the aftermath, the Soviets said 91,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner, although Powell has said it was actually 107,800, which is probably the more accurate figure. Of these, half of them died by the spring of 1943, and only 15,000 survived by May 1943. This means the majority of those captured were dead within a couple of months. And yet, a third of that 15,000 in May 1943 would survive and eventually make it back to Germany. So this is an indication that most of the deaths occurred immediately after the battle ended. And doing some quick maths, the overall survival rate was 4.63%, which means that the death rate for Stalingrad prisoners was 95.37%. Yes, there was no doubt some mistreatment by the Soviets, but there is a high likelihood that the high death toll was actually caused by other factors. Again, the statistics are all over the place, but for the entire war in the East, either 2,389,000 or 3,155,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner by the Soviet Union. Of that, somewhere between 356,000 and 459,000 did not survive Soviet captivity. So, depending on the particular set of statistics you use, somewhere between 11 and 20% did not survive, with a lot of the numbers coming in between 11 and 14%. But this figure is misleading because of Stalingrad. If we take the Stalingrad numbers out of the grand total, the death rate for German soldiers in Soviet captivity was somewhere between 8.5 or 15.4%, with 11.5% being a nice medium. So, the prisoners taken elsewhere had a death rate of 11.5%, but at Stalingrad the death rate of the prisoners was 95.37%, which is really strange. This is a huge discrepancy, which suggests that something at Stalingrad was not the norm. Did the Soviets really just kill 95% of the prisoners in cold blood? That's unlikely. They also probably didn't work them all to death either, because the mortality rate in the Gulag system was never that high. According to Wikipedia, even with the spike of deaths during the war years, the death rate in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics labor camp system was only 8.8%. Most of these deaths would have been through starvation, because, as explained in a previous video on the Soviet economy, starvation occurred in Russia and the Soviet Union every year between 1916 and 1949. If you do not include Gulag prisoners, then people starved in almost every year, because there were only 3 years where people in the main population didn't starve. As explained in the first episodes of this series, there were massive food shortages in the Soviet Union during the war, which is perhaps why the death rate of the Gulag system was higher than it was before or after the war. But even at its peak, the death rate was 24.9%, not 95.37%. So clearly, the deaths of the Stalingrad prisoners was atypical. It was not normal. Therefore, we must ask why it was so high. Were there unusual factors at Stalingrad that could explain why such a high proportion of prisoners died in the immediate aftermath of the starvation siege? And the answer is yes. Simply put, there were three major factors contributing to the high death toll of prisoners. One was the food. Due to overstretched supply lines, German rations had been poor for the Sixth Army since September 1942, if not earlier. They started slaughtering their horses for food in mid-October prior to Operation Uranus, simply because they weren't receiving adequate supplies. I've documented this throughout the series, with the conclusion being that the Sixth Army soldiers were deprived of food even before they were surrounded. Poor diet made the men unprepared for the siege, which is why so many starved to death during it. So by the time they surrendered, these guys were walking skeletons. During the siege, before the surrender, Wooster says, "Only now did I realise how wretched and gaunt the combat soldiers were. I was still living off my body fat from furlough. I had gone hungry for 6 weeks less than them, and as an artilleryman I had it better than the helpless and shelterless infantrymen out on the steppe. I now saw the starved and practically dead figures around me, who could barely find the strength to walk forward." And it's not like the Soviets were about to provide them with an open buffet. While some accounts talk of the Soviets enacting revenge on the Germans, which no doubt did happen, especially with some of the wounded, Colonel Adams says this: "Instead of beating our soldiers or even shooting them in the back of the neck, the Soviet men in the midst of the rubble of the city we had destroyed were digging in their pockets for the last pieces of bread, their cigarettes, and their tobacco to offer to the human wrecks of German soldiers." Now, we've got to be careful because Colonel Adam became a communist after the surrender, so his account may be biased towards the Soviets. However, Wooster also seems to suggest a similar thing. They had, of course, taken our wristwatches at the very start. In spite of my protests, the junior lieutenant had also taken my leather coat. He liked my lined leather gloves and took them off with a smile. As he was clambering back into his tank, he threw me a pair of oil-smear fur mittens and a little bag of Russian dried bread.
"We fed the prisoners well. We gave them white bread, rice, butter, and 50 grams daily of canned meat. Throughout the entire war, we frontline personnel did not receive such a ration."
So yes, some revenge did happen, and stragglers were shot if they failed to keep up with the columns marching towards the prisoner of war camps. Yet, other primary sources suggest that the Soviets were merciful to their captives and actually spared them food and tobacco. It's also clear that during the siege, the officers had been fed more than their troops, which explains why most of the survivors were officers and generals rather than the lower ranks. All the privates and non-commissioned officers were emaciated, and their clothes were infected with vermin. The German officers, on the other hand, were well fed and had pockets stuffed with cold sausage and other food, obviously left over after the meagre rations had been issued. The officers looked healthy and not in the least undernourished. Clearly, throughout the agony of Stalingrad, when their soldiers were dying of hunger, they were continuing to have more or less regular meals. The only man who looked in poor shape was Paulus himself. He looked pale and sick, and had a nervous twitch in his left cheek. This ties into the second factor, which was the Soviet treatment of prisoners. A report to Beria, dated on the 30th of December 1942, says that the Romanian and Italian prisoners they'd taken hadn't been fed by the Germans for at least 6 to 7 days prior to capture. In some cases, they hadn't been fed up to 10 days, meaning that they were already extremely hungry by the time they fell into Soviet hands. Again, this shows how bad the logistic situation was for the Axis. These prisoners were then marched by the Soviets up to 190 miles over the course of 2 or 3 more days without food, since the Red Army rear services weren't set up to supply them. Some were even given flour to eat rather than bread. Wounded and sick were not taken to hospitals but were sent to the rear, and all of this resulted in exhaustion and death for the Romanian and Italian prisoners. Beria's response was to order changes that would solve these issues, but Falk says that they weren't really implemented, and the mistreatment of prisoners continued. Many Red Army soldiers were badly undernourished, to say nothing of civilians, so the idea of giving any food at all to invaders who had plundered their country seemed almost perverse. rations finally started to arrive after 3 or 4 days, by which time many men had eaten virtually nothing for almost 2 weeks. Things were terrible at first, with some men resorting to eating corpses. But the rations actually improved in May 1943, which is when the death rate of German prisoners at Stalingrad started to decline. That's not a coincidence. This suggests that it was more like sheer incompetence on the part of the Soviets rather than deliberate neglect, but maybe it was a bit of both. And again, as I detail in episode 3 of this series, the Soviets were themselves suffering from food shortages brought on by a deadly combination of socialist incompetence and the Axis overrunning of the Ukraine. People starved to death in Moscow in 1942, a city not even under siege, and Soviet citizens and Red Army soldiers were given half the rations that an American or British soldier or civilian would receive during the war. So the Soviet Union was not a land of milk and honey, and there wasn't enough food for the Soviets themselves, let alone tens of thousands of new prisoners of war. One train carried thousands of Germans from the Volga to Uzbekistan in Central Asia. Inside each car, stuffed with 100 or more prisoners, a macabre death struggle ensued as the Germans killed each other for bits of food tossed to them every 2 days. By the time the train reached the Pamir Mountains, almost half its passengers were dead. The point is that the Germans at Stalingrad were on the brink of starvation during the siege, probably didn't receive much food as they were marched off to the camps, and then wouldn't have received bountiful amounts of food once they were there. This alone explains the high death rate. But there is a third factor. Colonel Adam explained that typhus started to spread during the siege, affecting 90% of the men by the time they entered Soviet captivity. He says it was typhus that would eventually kill off 80% of them within weeks. Despite the selfless commitment of Soviet doctors and nursing sisters, typhus deaths reaped a frightful harvest in the prisoner of war camps. It continued the cruel game of German militarism with the 6th Army further, leaving only a few thousand alive. The blame was borne by the same forces that had chased the 6th Army to the Volga, keeping them there in inhuman conditions with orders to hold on, until only the wreckage of humanity survived. Yes, it was the Germans who put themselves in this position. Typhus was spread by lice and would kill a large percentage of those infected if not treated. After the battle, some German POWs, protesting the horrid conditions, scraped handfuls of lice off their bodies and threw them at Russian guards. The guards' response was prompt execution of the offending prisoners. In fact, 50% of the female Soviet doctors contracted typhus, and many were lucky to have survived. So, rather than the majority of prisoners succumbing to Soviet brutality, it appears that typhus was the cause of most of the early deaths, probably in combination with starvation. And Colonel Adam had reported this in 1965. Yet the myth remains that the German prisoners from Stalingrad were worked to death or simply executed by the Soviets. And by the way, I've done videos on how the Germans and Soviets treated their prisoners of war, so you can check them out if you need more details. One more thing that I would like to point out though, that I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, and many of you said it was a good point, the Stalingrad airlift protracted this process. If the Stalingrad airlift hadn't happened, the 6th Army would have surrendered late November or early December, and while the troops would have been hungry, most of them would have had enough fat stores on their body to survive the initial march into Soviet captivity and probably wouldn't have been suffering from typhus. In such a scenario, we would have seen a much higher survival rate. So one big reason that so many soldiers at Stalingrad did not survive was because the airlift delivered just enough supplies to keep them going, prolonging their suffering and then causing them to starve to death. The Luftwaffe managed to supply either 6,591 tons or 8,350.7 tons of supplies in total, which, depending on how you count it, works out at either 112.9 or 131.7 tons per day over the 71 days and nights between the 24th of November and the 2nd of February. This wasn't even half of the minimum amount of tons required by the 6th Army, and we've got to remember that some of this was dropped but not received. In fact, Falk says this was only 14 supply train loads, which isn't much. And Bergstrom points out that the Luftwaffe only sent up an average of 95 transports per day, which is also a really low number, and this had nothing to do with a shortage of fuel apparently. There were 1,325 transports available, yet they somehow only managed to send 95 up per day. It just doesn't make sense. He also highlights that the amount that the Luftwaffe shipped to Stalingrad between August and November 1942 was nearly 400 tons per day, and he concludes that it was the Red Army Air Force plus the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground that was the decisive factor. I agree that the Red Army Air Force played its part, but clearly if they're only sending up 95 transports per day, then there's something wrong going on behind the scenes. They had 1,325 transports and 488 got damaged or destroyed, leaving 837 to continue to conduct air supply missions. But even if we said there were no losses, 1,325 aircraft split over 74 days means that each aircraft only went up on average 17.9 times during the 71-day siege. So each aircraft had 71 opportunities to go up in the air, assuming they went up once a day, and only managed to do so 17.9 times. Okay, sure, not every aircraft arrived on day one, and not every aircraft will be operational every single day. I understand that, but they could have gone up multiple times per day, so they're simply not sending these aircraft into the sky. Yes, the weather is a factor, but as I've shown previously, even that doesn't make sense because it's inconsistent. On certain days the weather cleared up, yet they didn't send up a single transport. And my point is that they're just not sending these transports into the sky, and this suggests that something was preventing them from doing so. Partly it could have been the weather, but I also think it was probably a lack of supplies. In 1941, Army Group Centre demanded 30 trains daily, but during the August period, they never got more than 18 daily. Even after the railways were improved, they never received 30 trains per day, and this was during the summer. In the winter between November and December 1941, hardly any trains arrived, and the 9th Army only got one fuel train between the 9th and 23rd of November. So if this was in 1941 when the German lines were closer to their bases, do you really think that sufficient supplies were reaching the front lines in the Caucasus during the winter of 1942? We've already seen that they were struggling in the August and September of 1942, so why would we assume that they were perfectly fine in the winter? I genuinely think that they had the transports and that they had the crews, but they didn't have the supplies. It really could be the case that insufficient supplies were reaching the air bases, and that's the primary reason why so few transports were sent up. But unfortunately, there isn't enough evidence to prove this one way or another. We really need a historian to dive into the primary sources for the railways in 1942, and this debate won't truly be solved until that happens. Historians need to understand actual economics and dive into the logistics. It should be noted though that the Luftwaffe had flown out about 30,000 soldiers from the Stalingrad pocket, out of the original 300,000 to 344,000 men trapped in the city. Since 107,800 entered Soviet captivity and 30,000 were flown out, that means that at least 162,000 men died during the siege, with the Soviets estimating the number of deaths at 146,300. As discussed before, the Soviets lost at least 69,000 of their 280,000 men during Operation Ring, at a time when the 6th Army had more than 210,000 men left. 41,000 homes, 300 factories, and 113 schools and hospitals had been reduced to rubble. And most tragically, only 7,655 civilians remained in Stalingrad at the end of the battle. The official death toll of civilians at Stalingrad was 40,000, with 125,000 said to have been evacuated prior to the battle. But Glan says that recently released NKVD documents paint a different story. More than 200,000 civilians were left in Stalingrad when the Germans entered it. Of these, only 7,655 survived in the city, meaning that at least 75,000 must have died during the siege itself, and approximately 186,000 civilians were sent to German factories, slave labour camps, or elsewhere, where most of them would die. Thus, simple but grisly arithmetic indicates that the actual death toll of civilians in Stalingrad was at least 80,000, and even if only half the forced labourers perished, that would bring the total to more than 170,000 people.
Bearing in mind that most genuine historians and the SS at the time say that the death toll in Dresden during the infamous bombing raid was 25,000, although some put it up to 40,000 just in case. So the Germans killed way more at Stalingrad than the Allies did at Dresden. Unless you're a neo-numpty and just make the numbers up, in which case a zillion people died at Dresden.
5 Axis armies had been destroyed during the Stalingrad campaign: 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army, Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, although the latter had barely been formed, the Italian 8th Army, and the Hungarian 2nd Army. In terms of manpower alone, this was an absolute disaster for the Axis, especially the Romanians, who lost over half of their troops compared to the Germans, who lost only about 10%. German troops in the line, unaware that Romanian losses in the east were thus far proportionally higher than their own, came to believe that all the Romanians had simply fled, and they treated them with increasing physical abuse and contempt. Romanian-German relations, already strained by diverging war aims in 1942, never recovered. But this wasn't an easy victory for the Soviets. The numbers are disputed, however, during the Stalingrad portion of the Fall-Blau campaign, so not including the Caucasus campaign, the Soviets recorded a staggering 1,212,189 casualties, while the Axis lost 250,000 men, most of them German. And by the time the 6th Army surrendered, the total losses came in at 1.7 million for the Soviets and 1 million for the Axis. The Soviets lost about 3,000 tanks, and the Germans 818 Panzers and Stugs, plus maybe a couple hundred more Axis Allied tanks. Luftflotte 4 probably lost around 588 to 638 aircraft out of the 900 aircraft lost on the Eastern Front. This left Luftflotte 4 with just 240 operational aircraft and another 384 awaiting repairs. Milch said that 488 transports and 1,000 crew members were lost during the airlift alone, and this included a third of all the Ju-52 transport aircraft that Germany had. Excluding transports, Luftflotte 4 had lost 39% of its combat strength between June 1942 and the 31st of January 1943. Worse, its operational rate had dropped from 71% to 38%. So they had less planes, and even fewer of these planes could now take to the skies. There were still 477 transport planes in the Luftwaffe, but only 146 were now operational. The air and ground crews were also totally exhausted, morale had cratered, and several Luftwaffe units were totally disbanded. This is compared to 200 Soviet aircraft losses for the airlift, showing that the Stalingrad airlift was actually a disaster for the Luftwaffe. This was a Soviet victory, and an important turning point in the war. But as the statistics make clear, this was a hard-won victory to say the least, and it took several months to get to this victory. There was a terrible amount of suffering for all involved, and to ram this point home, more Stalingrad civilians died than there are seconds in this series. If you times the number of seconds by 10, you'd only get the number of Axis troops lost in the Stalingrad campaign, let alone the Soviet losses, let alone
the Caucasus campaign as well. This is a staggering waste of human lives, all over some cities and a few oil wells. And I'm not saying it wasn't important, it obviously was, but it would be better to mourn this victory rather than to celebrate it. The disasters of 1941 and 1942 were twisted to suit Stalin's agenda. The propaganda now said that he deliberately allowed the troops to fall back in 1941 and 42, drawing the Axis into a massive trap at Stalingrad, and any other narrative was not allowed. But this was complete nonsense. The Red Army had been on the back foot until the Axis overstretched their logistics, and only then did the Red Army have the time to catch their breath, refit and strike back. But this strategy wasn't deliberate, it's just how it worked out. The reason for this victory should be obvious. Germany didn't have enough troops to fight the Second Summer Campaign, and therefore had to split one army group into two and then send it in three separate directions, weakening each thrust. Hitler and Halder messed this up, and the planning and execution weren't great. They also had to rely on Axis allied armies which simply weren't able to hold the line, and their logistics were stretched beyond breaking point. The Battle of Stalingrad really was lost before they even entered the city, but after getting embroiled in Stalingrad, the Sixth Army was then bled white and couldn't assist when the Romanians were smashed on their flanks. Manstein was unable to break through to them, and with more attacks going on against the Hungarians and Italians, that was it. The Caucasus was abandoned, and Sixth Army was doomed. Many blame Paulus or Hitler for the disaster, and they certainly have their faults. But others that need to take the blame include Halder, von Weichs, Army Group B's commander, Hott of 4th Panzer Army, and Manstein. These are often overlooked, and really they can't be. The Soviets also got their act together during the campaign, and Chuikov, holding out at Stalingrad, allowed the Soviets to build up for their first successful offensive operation of the war, Operation Uranus. And by the way, Chuikov survived, having almost died 12 or possibly 13 times, depending on how you count it. It could be argued though, and indeed it was at the time, that the Soviets only won because they attacked the Axis allied armies, and the Germans were outnumbered and overstretched. And to an extent, this is true. It wouldn't be until Kursk that the Soviets were able to go toe-to-toe with the Germans and finally prove that they could actually defeat them in a pitched battle. When Paulus surrendered, he was suffering from dysentery and was deeply depressed by this point, and would spend the next few years in Soviet captivity along with his generals. I'm not going to cover this period because I don't need to. Anton Jolly has done a fantastic series narrated by Brad on Paulus and his officers in the prisoner of war camp, so I'm going to link to that below and encourage you to all watch it. And I recently reviewed every book I used in this series, so if you're looking to further your understanding of this battle, check out this video right here. Otherwise, you and I have officially survived the Battle of Stalingrad documentary. Most people did not get this far, so congratulations, your horse meat ration has been increased. Thanks for watching, bye for now.